And thank you for joining us today, and also to UNDP for organizing this series of e-conferences on responses to COVID-19 in the Eastern Caribbean. My name is Regis Chapman, and I'm the head of the United Nations World Food Program in the Caribbean. I'm extremely excited to be here today and to chair this important session with a group of distinguished panelists who we'll have the pleasure to hear from shortly. But first, I'd like to set the stage for why this topic is more important than ever. The Caribbean is not normally on the headline news of food security issues and is far from the spotlight of what is considered global hotspots. Okay. However, every hurricane season, every earthquake, or in this case, economic shock, bring food security front and center for many people in the Caribbean. And while the region is still far better off than many parts of the world at the macro level, shocks like COVID-19 show how quickly this can change. And why is that? Well, it's important to understand some of the underlying issues in the Caribbean, namely poverty and inequality. The issue of income classification hides these issues in macro level statistics and figures and hampers government's ability to adequately invest in addressing them. Economic dependence on 1 to 2 key industries, largely service industries, that are dependent as much on what's happening outside of the countries as inside. We saw this with the high food and fuel price crisis of 2008, and we're seeing it again with COVID-19. Despite, or perhaps partially because of, the government's strong response to COVID-19, while the health aspects have been handled extremely well to date, economic and livelihood impacts have been significant and are expected to continue. The third area is fiscal space and indebtedness. This is a well-known issue in the Caribbean and links very much to the issue of income classification. Now, furthermore, there's this vulnerability to natural events that has always been there, but with climate change, we're seeing a greater severity of storms. While hurricanes are not the only risk factor for the Eastern Caribbean, we've seen what can happen in recent years and the impact that these events have on economies, livelihoods, and food security. I'm sure most of you are aware, but in 2017, following Hurricane Maria, Dominica lost over 200% of its GDP. These events erased development gains and set back countries by a generation, if not more. As if we need a reminder of this risk, there have already been 3 named storms in the Atlantic this year, and we're only 9 days into the hurricane season. So while food security is perhaps not the topic that tends to be front and center in the Caribbean on the global stage, or even in the regional development context, it needs much greater attention. As you may or may not be aware, on behalf of the CARICOM Secretariat, WFP launched an online survey to assess the impact of COVID-19 on food security and livelihoods. The survey ran from the 1st to the 12th of April, an early stage of restrictions for much of the Caribbean. Now, COVID-19 has had widespread disruptions to markets. As this map here shows, some of the most acute impacts were experienced in the Eastern Caribbean, where a much higher percentage of the population had a time when they were unable to access markets. This was largely due to movement restrictions, closures of markets and stores, and fear of the population to go out. People have changed how they shop, as surely you have as well, and we're seeing price increases have been reported by nearly 60% of the respondents. Livelihoods have also been severely impacted, again, largely driven by movement restrictions. This has impacted all livelihoods, from those dependent on petty trade to informal and casual labor to business owners. Nearly half of the respondents reported job loss or reduced income and revenue. Again, the Eastern Caribbean fared particularly bad in this regard. While Belize had the highest reported income changes, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Grenada rounded out the top 5. This map reflects the degree to which people perceive their livelihoods being impacted moving forward. Irrespective of the degree, what's critical to note is 90% of people feel that COVID-19 will impact their livelihoods in the future moving forward. Let that sink in for a minute. 90% of people reported that COVID-19 will impact their livelihoods in the future. That alone speaks miles, irrespective of the color of the country's map on that picture there. So what does this all mean in terms of food security? Well, while over half of the respondents were not having difficulty eating enough food, we're seeing people skipping meals and eating less preferred food, which is a sign of negative coping strategies. Based on the survey results and secondary data, WFP estimates that there are some 403,000 people who are severely food insecure across the English-speaking Caribbean, 1.3 million who are moderately food insecure. As this map reflects, the Eastern Caribbean has a number of countries of concern, particularly Dominica and St. Lucia. Outside of the Eastern Caribbean, again, we see Belize has a higher degree of severe food insecurity as well. Now, one last map I wanted to show, I think truly sums up the vulnerability of the Caribbean from a food security perspective. The Caribbean imports over 80% of its food and has a $5 billion import bill. While global production levels are good, issues around supply chains and labor markets could become an issue for import-reliant countries like SIDS in the Caribbean. So finally, what can we do? Well, there are many partners working on food security agenda, and we'll hear from some of them today. In the case of WFP, we're trying to build on the significant interventions by governments around the region and supporting them with these challenges where we can. This includes scaling up cash assistance through social protection in both Dominica and St. Lucia in order to meet food security and other basic needs. We're increasing our technical assistance to governments around the region to help them look at how they use their social protection systems and programs to meet the growing number of people in need and also to address food security and other basic income related issues. And then finally, supporting CARICOM Secretariat with surveys such as the one that we conducted and a follow-up survey that's planned to track progress and change over time, and also technical assistance. The CARICOM food security agenda is one that's been on the table for many years. And in light of COVID-19, CARICOM has an action plan for food security in relation to the current crisis. And it reiterates, again, the need to diversify income, the need to strengthen inter-regional trade and reduce the degree of import reliance throughout the region. Now, enough from me. So let's get on with the discussion. We have four fantastic panelists today who are going to help us delve deeper into this discussion. But let me start with Mr. Anton Belgrave. Mr. Belgrave is the Director of Research and Economic Analysis Department at the Central Bank of Barbados. Mr. Belgrave, a certified financial risk manager, has been employed with the central bank for over 10 years and specializes in financial stability and macroeconomic forecasting. Mr. Belgrave, over to you.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair, and thanks for handing over. I'm going to give a presentation basically looking at the concept of economic diversification as part of the COVID-19 response. And I thought it would be useful to begin by looking at how we got to where we are right now. And in terms of Barbados, if we look at the post-independence period, we had a transition away from sugar. And Barbados began that transition away from an agricultural society in the late 1960s. In about 1966, agriculture was about 24% of GDP and employed 27% of the labor force. And basically what happened is that agriculture was dominated by the sugar harvest. And that earned Barbados about 88% of its export earnings around that time. By 2016, however, agriculture had declined to about 3.8% of GDP, 0.9% of jobs. And non-sugar agriculture significantly exceeded the value added we were getting from sugar. Turning now to some of our key challenges in agriculture. One of the characteristics of Barbados and several of the other islands actually in the Eastern Caribbean is that the soil is relatively thin. In Barbados, we have about 2 feet of organic matter on top of an organic limestone cap, except for an area we call the Scotland District. Annual rainfall is fairly low in Barbados as well too. and it's low for most arable crops. We have a problem with salt-laden winds as well. And there's also a acute demand for agricultural land to be released into commercial, residential, and industrial uses, basically. Consequently, the amount of arable land has declined from about 38% to about 25% by 2013. And this is an estimate that was done by a survey by the World Bank. So as you can see, there are pressures really pushing you away from agriculture as you try to fulfill the needs of tourism, industry, and housing from your local residents. I would add to this slide, I think I mentioned it later, that Barbados is one of the most densely populated islands in the countries in the world. Now, we've had some success in terms of our diversification. And this diversification has been seen in the relative shares of the non-sugar and sugar agriculture, basically. And areas where governments have seen notable successes have been in chicken and pork production, sweet potatoes, milk production, and rum production. One of the downsides, however, is that increased production has been bought, so to speak, by having high effective rates of protection for these industries. Production costs are high in the region, and especially so in Barbados. We also have fairly high tariffs. In agriculture, the average is something around 33%, but it ranges from 0 to 214%. And there are also some non-tariff measures, as well as significant fiscal transfers to the agricultural sector. So if you look at a graph basically of sugar versus non-sugar, you can see that what I was alluding to previously. You can see the acute decline in the sugar industry. And while we've had some degree of growth in the non-sugar agricultural industry, as I mentioned. Now, looking at the effect of tourism, COVID, and domestic agriculture, we can see there are a number of different interrelated effects. Now, Barbados is highly import dependent, as the chairman mentioned. Food imports have grown to about 320 million as of 2019. This represents about a fifth of our total merchandise imports. We have trade deficits in just about all the food categories: fruits, meats, dairy products, and even fish. Under normal conditions, this is kind of a manageable situation. You have a situation whereby chronic trade deficits, especially in these areas, and in most of the non-commodity producing islands, is facilitated by your earnings from tourism, FDI, borrowings, and in some cases, remittances. Hotels are crucial to Barbados' survival. Directly, the tourism industry makes up about 70% of the Barbados economy, but the indirect effects are much more significant. So you could easily double this figure when considering the indirect effects and the induced effects from tourism. Currently, tourism earns the vast majority of hard currency necessary to pay for this import food bill. And given COVID, tourism has been shut down effectively for about 2 months now. There are a number of domestic actions which we can take to kind of improve our domestic agricultural production. Predial larceny is a large issue in Barbados, and successive governments have tried to some degree to address these issues with some limited success. Some areas that have shown promise are cassava production, breadfruit production, sweet potato production for both food and for feeds, basically. We need to explore more strategies in terms of commercializing the value-added products from sugar, because while the sugar industry has shrunk, we still have it's still an extremely valuable resource, and given Barbados's particular climatic conditions, sugar is still one of the best crops to grow, given the soil conditions, etc., the lack of water. But we also need to look at ways to improve our harvesting of water, etc., because the water availability is a significant issue in Barbados, and one would argue that it would be best to do harvest rainwater and avoid the use of potable water for as much as possible for your agriculture. Now, when we look at the impact of COVID-19 and food availability, COVID-19 actually did not result in a shortage of available local food. As was highlighted in the survey, the disruption really arose mainly from being able to access the food and restrictions around the accessing the food. One area that has been affected in the short term, however, and severely affected, is the impact on incomes. This is where COVID-19 has really impacted the ability of persons to feed themselves. So the domestic farming sector hasn't been disrupted per se too much, because arrangements were made in terms of facilitating access to food by persons. But incomes now, that is another matter. Incomes have been severely affected. Tourism has been effectively shut down. Based on what we are seeing with unemployment claims, we can be fairly confident that unemployment has probably doubled and possibly increased even more. And income losses have spanned the full gamut of society. But I've highlighted the fact that it has, in particular, is hit the persons who operated kind of more in the informal sector or at the margins of society, because some of the other sectors can draw upon the formal systems of savings or unemployment insurance to kind of compensate for their income losses. So it's really those persons who are at the margin who operate informally that it's been particularly problematic. The longer term problem, though, is tourism is the central engine of economic growth in much of the Caribbean, and certainly in Barbados. So the central question for us is, when will tourism recover and have the scale which then permits us to kind of feed ourselves? Absent tourism earnings, it is a really difficult question to answer as to how our local economies can feed themselves. Tourism earnings also they permit the purchase of inputs into our commercial agriculture, whether they be the periodic removal of the cow herds, etc. So tourism is actually intertwined into agriculture in the sense that it permits the purchase of inputs, fertilizers, etc., that permits much of the commercial agriculture to exist. Looking beyond COVID-19, there's a deep need for significant investment in climate-smart agriculture. The forecast models we are seeing all suggest that the drought will persist and increase as climate change accelerates, and the Caribbean is going to be one of the regions that is hit pretty hard by the global warming phenomenon. And we already are in a situation whereby we've had significant runs of droughts for successive years for an extended period of time. And hints of this future can be seen in Barbados's inflation rates. The most recent inflation shock we had was actually driven by domestic vegetables, and that tomatoes and such forth were heavily affected by drought conditions, as well as fishing. And fishing seemed to have been impacted significantly by the sargassum effect, which seems to be somewhat associated with climate change or pollution. We're not absolutely sure which one as yet either. The Caribbean diet is based heavily on highly processed imported food. And this is strongly correlated with our obesity rates and all the attendant ills that we have, concerning diabetes, etc. And global supply chains look increasingly fragile from a political economy sense, with the resurgence of nationalism throughout the world. So this is once again underscores the urgency that the Caribbean has in terms of building out its capacity to improve its ability to feed itself. We're going to need continuing support from our international partners, and I've highlighted some of the areas in this final slide. The education of farmers. We have no winter in the Caribbean, and the consequence of this is the pests never really die off. They're always there. You always have to be fighting the multitude of pests we have in the Caribbean. You always need to improve your farmers' knowledge of pest control, the handling of pesticides, fertilizer applications, health and safety, post-harvest actions, etc. I think we should, and as I said, we need to focus a lot too on organic farming, crop rotation, etc. We can't just depend on some of the farming models that are prevalent in developed countries, because there's a severe consequence in terms of things like fertilizer runoff for our marine ecosystems, etc. We need to invest in the certain techniques such as greenhouses, vertical farms, container farms, etc. And we need to continue, and we've had some good support from the international community in terms of agricultural science. Now, with a 10 to 30% fall off in rainfall projected, as I said, the Caribbean actually had Barbados had one of the highest inflation rates for a non-conflict country in 2019, etc. So, with further stress expected from climate change, we can see those price shocks coming again, and this is something that will extend beyond, even if we find the solution for the COVID problem. In terms of, we need continued support in terms of building out the farm and management information systems, ensuring that farmers know what crops to produce and what prices are available. And we also need assistance in terms of managing what is termed the blue economy, or fisheries, etc. Finally, I think the UN needs to avoid this notion of middle income economies being able, especially small middle income economies, being graduated. While these economies may have a comparatively high per capita income, there is the issue of fragility, and for this fragility is borne out by COVID, where you have economies that are effectively tied to one industry shut down because there are very little alternatives in terms of alternative production systems, etc. And I thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, Mr. Belgrave, for those excellent inputs. I'd now like to pass over to Mr. Juan Carlos de los Viñas. He's the Inter-American Development Bank's representative for Barbados. From his native Barranquilla in Colombia, he was trained as a MD in Northern University and holds a Master in Health Economics from York University in the UK. He's also known in his own right as an avant-garde abstract plastic artist. Juan Carlos, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm really pleased. It's an honor to be doing this today with all these distinguished panelists and on the discussion on economics and economic diversification. And I think we may think that food security and economic diversification could be divergent topics, but actually they are pretty much convergent, and they share a common vulnerability to external shocks, natural disasters, climate change, and now a pandemic. So they also aim to build, in both cases, a resilient economy and resilient agriculture. In the case of Barbados, this was explained, the shrinking process of the agricultural sector to be now close to 2%, and a very small economy, very much dependent on tourism. And when tourism shut down, it creates a wave of economic problems and almost economic collapse. We know the government of Barbados has been putting forward many, many policies to cope with the situation. But as we see in the surveys, and I think some of the surveys were mentioned, we also run a second round of our telephone surveys, and we see that in general in the Caribbean, almost the number of households, vulnerable households, have almost doubled. So, and vulnerable households, that means households that earn below the minimum wage. And that only in the 6 weeks after the beginning of the pandemic. And also another part of the survey found that almost 50% of the households that were interviewed felt that in the past week they felt hunger. So the number of people suffering and the number of job losses is staggering, and it creates an impact on food security and the possibility of families to eat. And in the case of Barbados, there's also a sort of paradox, because Barbados met the hunger targets of the UN, the MDGs, and also calorie consumption, but at the same time is facing, as many other countries, the impact of obesity, and in the case particular of Barbados, high level of diabetes. So how you reconcile the two things? In the case of economic diversification, there are several options that may create also problems. I would mention investment in renewable energies, for example, that has a positive impact on resilience and a positive impact in green agriculture. The Barbados government has a very ambitious target in terms of renewable energy installation that it may bring up to 60 megawatts a year for a decade, and investments of more than $200 million a year, and may need land to install solar PVs, and also it may compete with arable land, but also may bring about a lot of investment and job creation. So we are seeing a potential for a new sector of the economy to grow, but it may have an impact on the use of land. So this is a topic where proper planning and use of technology may serve the purpose of having better policy decisions based on science. And also, and we have heard this from several countries, the agriculture and the possibility of cannabis production, and that could be a competition in terms of arable land and pricing of the land, etc. So definitely there are possibilities in terms of economic diversification, but based on the fact that there are interrelationships between economic diversification, agriculture, and climate and resilience, we need to be very careful in using science to make the right policy decisions. We also know, and this is an example of a policy decision, is the program the government of Barbados is putting forward, the FEED program, that relies on ownership, small farming, and technology. And I think addresses many of the issues that are important to increase the production, targeting very strategic crops, using technology to do precision agriculture, being very careful in terms of water usage, using ways to create biomass and energy, and trying to do the first circle with technology to facilitate the marketing and contacting the farmers with the markets. We, as IDB, had a project in the past that may bring some important lessons now that we are seeing this program put forward by the government of Barbados and some other programs in some other countries that try to address the issue of food security. And in the program we supported, we tried to connect local farming with the hotel association. And some of the lessons are, the hotels need to be very careful in proper grading and pricing, because the local farmers need to know exactly how much they are going to pay. And there has to be a lot of transparency in terms of the grading of the products. That builds trust and it creates a long-term relationship. Also, consolidation, because for the hotels and even for restaurants, they need to rely on consistency in quantity and timing. And so having an intermediary that can consolidate and have a relationship with the local farmers, do the sorting, and keeping the constant production and relationship with the hotels, it creates really a positive intermediary that helps both parties in the process. And also this intermediary can do also factoring, so they will manage the relationship with the farmers to properly and timely pay for their products, and also to some sort of backup for the hotels in case the production decreases or declines. So we learned these lessons, and I think these are lessons that should be applied to programs that are put forward by the countries, because it's not a perfect market. We are dealing with small farmers that need a lot of technology and training, and they need to build trust, not only if they want to produce for food security for the countries, but also if they want to be an increasing part of the economy. So this is a lesson, an example that really fits into the whole wider discussion about how to bring together economic diversification and food security. We also have been working with Global Affairs Canada, with EcoMicro, in bringing about a climate finance for small farmers. And I think this is another gap in the market. And the idea is to work with financial intermediaries that can do market assessments and can connect the providers of technology with small farmers to use climate technologies to make agriculturally resilient production, and using some financing to help fill the gap in terms of financing, but a proper financing for climate resilient agriculture. So this is a program we are working on in several countries of the Eastern Caribbean. We can share information with you because it's really important for this type of program to be widely promoted, because they really fill a gap in terms of technology and financing possibilities. And just to finalize, I will also send information about a challenge we are putting forward. It is called Beyond Tourism. It may offer some grants up to $500 million or loans. And the idea is to promote projects and possibility to work for development and also sustainable projects that may go beyond tourism. We know these islands will be heavily dependent on tourism, but for economic diversification, we need to go beyond, to look beyond and find possibilities. So bringing about these financing possibilities and promoting and fostering innovation, I think this is one of the key aspects for a sustainable path to growth, prosperity, and food security. Thank you.
And thank you, Juan Carlos, for those great insights. Just to flag, I had mentioned at the beginning the World Food Program CARICOM survey, but IADB also conducted, as you mentioned, a very similar survey. And in comparing some of the results, we saw a lot of similarities across the two, which I think helps to show the degree of impact that we're seeing as a result of COVID-19. So congratulations for that work, and I think you also highlighted some of the nuances in the comparison of economies that are dependent on tourism as opposed to other service economies. So really hats off to the IDB for that excellent piece of work as well. Before passing to the next speaker, I'd like to remind everyone, and it was posted on all of the social media communicating this e-conference as well as on the invitations. But if you have any questions for any of the panelists, those can be posted on the UETV website or on the United Nations Development Program Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean Facebook page. And at the end of the presentations, we'll be taking some questions and answers. So to pass on to our next speaker, Mr. Stefan Kosov is the head of the UK's Department for International Development, or DFID, for the Caribbean. Prior to that, he was the head of Profession for Governance in DFID, a role which included technical oversight and leadership of DFID's 120 plus governance advisors. Stefan joined DFID in 1999 and has provided governance advice to many DFID country programs, including long-term postings in East Africa and the Middle East. His areas of specialism include political economy analysis, democratic governance, public sector reform, and justice policy. Mr. Kosov, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. And of course, I won't be speaking about any of those issues this morning. But I just wanted to say thank you very much, first and foremost, to UNDP for convening this series of discussions. I think at a time of crisis for the region and indeed the world, it's obviously important that we come together as international actors and domestic partners to chart out a way forward. So this conversation and these series of conversations are very much welcomed by us. I mean, building on the previous presentations, I want to focus what I'm going to say squarely on the question of economic diversification in the round, hopefully building on what we've heard about issues around food security and agriculture. But before I move to talk about the situation in the Caribbean, I do just want to give a flavour of how this crisis is impacting on the UK and how we in the UK are looking to address some of the core economic challenges which confront us. Because there is obviously a we're in it all together element to this particular crisis. So as you all know, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact in the UK, with more than 40,000 people now having lost their lives. Every one of those deaths has been a personal tragedy, of course. But economically too, we face a significant fallout from the domestic shutdown. I think the UK's Independent Office of Budget Responsibility has estimated a second quarter GDP contraction of up to 35%. And the annual contraction could be our largest in 300 years. So this is huge. And in response to that, the UK government has had to mount unprecedented stimulus response amounting to around 20% of GDP. And this is very much aimed at giving support to those who can't work and also providing a bridge for businesses whose revenue streams have fallen through the floor as a result of the crisis. So we've now got a situation where almost 9 million workers and 1 million businesses are covered by the government's furlough scheme, which will cover 80% of salary costs from the public purse until October. Alongside some of these short-term challenges, we're also thinking about the future. And that means repairing some of our key existing sectors like our auto industry and our retail sector. But it also means thinking about new opportunities, for example, in the pharmaceutical sector or in medical device manufacturing sectors. And we clearly need to look out to new markets. Everyone will know the story around the ambitious free trade agreement that we're currently negotiating with the EU. But we've also launched formal trade negotiations with the US and soon with Australia, New Zealand and Japan. And in the Caribbean, we're particularly excited to start implementing the new CARIFORUM UK Economic Partnership Agreement, deepening our bilateral trade relationship with this region, particularly in new areas like e-commerce and tech-enabled trade. And I think we'd all agree that these new trade opportunities will be more important than ever, both for us in the UK and the Caribbean region. I think one thing that is palpably clear is that the world's not going to return to normal after COVID-19. The global economy will shift significantly in ways we're only just starting to understand. And I think we in the UK recognise that we will need to be agile and we'll need to diversify if we're going to maintain living standards in the future. But I think it's fair to say that our national efforts will count for little unless they are fortified by international cooperation. And that's why the UK has focused so heavily on supporting a coordinated international response to the crisis. The UK government so far pledged close to $1 billion of UK aid, much of which has gone through the UN system and the international financial institutions, to stop the spread of the pandemic and save lives around the world. This includes our work on finding a vaccine. People would have seen the UK hosting the Global Vaccine Summit last week, as well as efforts to mitigate the economic damage from the crisis. We've scaled up our funding to the IMF and the other regional development banks to support the most vulnerable economies and create new credit lines for countries at risk of debt distress. And I'm really pleased to say that several countries in this region, including St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada, have already been able to draw down on some of this critical emergency support. And the UK has also led the call to action on remittances with Switzerland, which is obviously so important for this region, given the reliance on remittances, particularly from the UK. And last but not least, our Prime Ministers agreed at the recent UN Summit on Financing for Development to lead a new international coalition for sustainable recovery and building back better, which I know is a topic close to many Caribbean hearts and indeed will be a key theme of our own COP26, which we'll be hosting next year. So we've already heard about the stark challenge that this region will face in building back post-COVID. Some of the figures are frankly jaw-dropping in terms of the impact of the crisis on tourist revenues and on GDP. And it's clear that once again, this crisis, as with previous emergencies, has again exposed the region's narrow economic base. There's obviously an urgency to reopen economies to tourism and get back to business as usual. And of course, tourism will be critical to the short-term recovery, as will key commodity exports. That's one of the reasons why the UK, in announcing our new global tariff last month, has retained preferential access to Caribbean producers of bananas, sugar and rum to the UK market. But beyond some of these short-term measures, it's clear we really do need a fundamental look at the region's economic model, and particularly the role that diversification can play as part of this wider transformation agenda. We in DFID like to think we've made a small contribution to advancing thinking and work in this space. One of our key programs is the Compete Caribbean program with Juan Carlos in the IDB, but also the CDB and Government of Canada. And this program has been supporting firms to grow, innovate, and enter new sectors and markets for several years. There's been some notable success stories, including the work to overhaul Grenada's tourism marketing through the Pure Grenada brand, the development of the edible shrimp sector for export in Belize, and also the ornamental fish sector in Jamaica, as well as other success stories. But the private sector's ability to grasp some of these new opportunities, I think, continues to be constrained by several factors. First and foremost, the enabling environment for business, or lack thereof. I think there's still too many countries in the region who are scoring quite poorly against doing business indicators, and in so doing, I guess, putting obstacles in the way of entrepreneurs who want to start up businesses and run them. Secondly, we all know that the region faces a huge infrastructure deficit. The UK is again doing a small amount in this space through our flagship UK SIF programme, where we're supporting 14 major infrastructure investment projects, from roads to ports, to water supply, to agricultural extension in 9 countries in the region. But there's still a lot to do, and of course the resilience dimensions of that are so critical. And thirdly, the region continues to suffer from a somewhat narrow skills base. Countries urgently need to develop some of their own human capital to capitalise on some of the newer opportunities in the global economy. And that means investing in the youth. And indeed, our youth skills programme has already been working to grow skills for a future labour force in 4 Eastern Caribbean countries. But that clearly needs to be part of a wider vision amongst governments in the region to support those new sectors which have the potential to drive Caribbean growth and long-term recovery. Clearly, digital services is one of these sectors where the region has clear potential comparative advantages, and we're already starting to see some of that with the budding business processing sector. The digital revolution also means that the Caribbean's creative industries can get content out in new ways, and indeed that's something that we'd like to support more through our new UK Trade Partnerships programme, which we launched in the recent week. And others have mentioned renewable energy, critical potential growth sector, which has the possibility of transforming economies in the region, and indeed we're supporting that work on geothermal energy exploration in several countries in the Eastern Caribbean. And also there was mention of the blue economy. I've heard Prime Minister Motley talk many times about how she wants a transformation in the perception of countries in this region, being less seen as small island development states and more as big ocean economies. I think that's really, there's something in that, and there's some clearly real possibilities there for the region, both in economic and environmental terms. But governments also do need to be thinking about new approaches to existing sectors, including tourism, with international travel going down, with consumer preferences shifting. I think there's a growing onus to think about a more diversified tourism product for the region, which is focused more on value and less on the volume associated with the food tourism industry. Others have already covered the issues around agriculture, but clearly there's more potential in the agriculture sector than what the region is currently realising, both for meeting domestic demand and boosting foreign exchange. So lastly, as well as thinking about what needs to be done to shift the dial on diversification, I think it's really important that the region thinks about the how, and that will clearly require concerted action at national levels, at the regional level, and at the international. At the national level, several countries in the region have established economic recovery task forces to manage the crisis. I think it would be a very good idea if these would stay on and put to the task of thinking long term and strategically about the way forward, and drawing on the strengths from government, from private sector and civil society to do that. Regional action and cooperation is also clearly going to be vital, as countries will not be able to do this alone. And as was mentioned at the start, actually, there are some encouraging signs around this, particularly through the CARICOM's work towards a regional food security approach. But we think the region needs to go further in thinking about longer term regional diversification strategies. And last but not least, this is clearly a time for deepening international cooperation writ large, which feels quite challenging to say given the choppy geopolitical waters that we currently inhabit. But it is no doubt true to say that the challenges of COVID are not bound by borders, neither can the solutions be. And we've really got a unique opportunity here to recalibrate both what we do and how we do it. And I certainly hope that on the back of these kind of conversations, we in the UK, partners in the Caribbean, and other international stakeholders can continue to work closely together to achieve this aim. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. I liked very much how you began reminding us that this is actually a global issue. It's a global pandemic with global health and global economic consequences. And we're certainly seeing those consequences here in the Caribbean, but it is an important reminder that this goes beyond our borders. And then ending it on that point again, that it being a global issue, it requires global partnerships and solutions tailored to the Caribbean as well, but that take into account those global aspects. So thank you very much. I'd like now to pass on to our fourth and final panelist, Dr. Renata Clark. Dr. Clark is the coordinator of FAO's sub-regional office for the Caribbean. In her current role, she oversees the FAO representations throughout the Caribbean, including the offices for Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Belize. Dr. Clark has worked at the FAO headquarters in the areas of food safety for the past 20 years, and since 2011, she was the head of FAO Food Safety and Quality Unit. She holds a PhD in Food Science and Technology from the Technical University of Nova Scotia and a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of the West Indies. Renata, over to you, please.
Thank you, Regis. I'm very pleased to be part of this process, this thinking process for the Caribbean and how we move forward with food security and economic diversification. So we've heard several people already say this COVID-19 pandemic has put under the magnifying glass pre-existing well-known problems. High dependence on tourism and related services has meant that our economies have taken a very heavy blow. We are in uncharted territory, and the projections are changing rapidly, but the ballpark figures are frightening. Estimates of GDP reduction for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean range between 9 and 16%. The unemployment projections in the face of the pandemic are between 30 to 40%. Youth unemployment was already flagged as a problem pre-COVID, and according to the ILO, youth and women are the most affected by the loss of income earning opportunities during the present crisis. So the problem becomes bigger. The case for economic diversification was always clear. The arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic has simply prodded us to recognize the urgency of the situation. Investing in resilience is an absolute and urgent imperative. So what does this mean for food security? With such high unemployment and loss of livelihoods, ensuring economic access to adequate, safe, and nutritious food is an obvious problem. According to an FAO analysis covering low-income food deficit countries as well as net food importing countries, under a relatively optimistic scenario of 5% loss of GDP, it was estimated that there would be an additional 30 million people undernourished. In a more realistic and pessimistic scenario of 10% GDP reduction, there would be over 80 million more undernourished. The numbers are startling, even though it is no surprise that poverty limits one's access to food. Additionally, there's quite a bit of evidence that food prices have increased substantially since the end of February 2020. The big data COVID-19 price tracker on the FAO website shows 15 to 20% increases in the prices of food baskets in the Caribbean, with a couple of notable exceptions like Dominica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So apart from loss of employment and higher food prices, it's also estimated that the remittances will be down by about 20% in 2020 in Latin America and the Caribbean. Remember, it's not just a question of access to food, it's a question about access to healthy diets. The Caribbean is already facing a huge problem of obesity and related high public health and economic costs of NCDs. In the case of female obesity, we have rates that are among the highest in the world. If indeed we are going to have repeated waves of COVID-19, we have an added reason to seriously tackle the NCD epidemic, although we didn't need another reason. Safeguarding food security is going to require carefully targeted social protection in the short term, including things like cash transfer and food baskets that Regis mentioned. Areas where FAO is more active include Cash Plus programs that support backyard and small-scale farmers with cash plus inputs plus technical support, as well as school feeding programs. An important point here is that we need to make sure that the targeting of beneficiaries is based on solid information. There are a number of assessments that have been undertaken and that are on the way. Hopefully they're complementary and not just contributing to questionnaire fatigue. FAO is currently working with the CARICOM Secretariat to prepare for the implementation of surveys, looking more closely at the situation of family households, farming households, and fisherfolk livelihoods. For the long term, we simply have to build back better. And since I'm from FAO, I will limit my focus to how the food and agriculture sector can contribute to a diversified and resilient economy. Business as usual has not worked very well for us, so we can't revert to that. In fact, it has led us to the slowest economic growth rates in the world, increasing unemployment, increasing marginalization of our youth, and continued deterioration of our social fabric. We really do need to rethink what we've been doing. So what's the status of our food and agriculture and fisheries sectors? Currently, and we've heard from previous speakers, food imports account for up to 90% of food supply in some Eastern Caribbean states. We are eating up our foreign exchange reserves unproductively. Contribution of GDP is small. For Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, it's between 3 and 5%, with a notable exception of Dominica. Agricultural productivity is low compared with the rest of the world. The sector is made up largely of small farms and small-scale fishers with little access to capital. We have weak data on who our farmers are, where they are, what they're producing, and this makes it hard to plan, hard to optimize linkages to markets, and hard to facilitate recovery in the case of major disruptions, as we see each year with the hurricane season. Water resources are a major constraint in some of the countries, and with the saltwater intrusion and the more frequent droughts linked with climate change phenomena, this challenge is increasing. In the case of the fisheries sector, for the small island states of the OECS, Their ocean space accounts for 85% of their sovereign area. So I really do like the term that's being diffused recently, referring to these countries as large ocean economies. The blue economy is certainly a big growth area, and in terms of fisheries, we are underperforming. Many species are being overfished. IUU, or illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, accounts for about 30% of the fish removed from the oceans. Some countries have been flagging foreign industrial vessels to catch pelagic fish, such as tuna. Sometimes the government receives what appears to be very limited remuneration from these licenses, so others are benefiting from our resources and reducing opportunities for our small-scale fishers. There is a regional plan of action to prevent, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing, but only 14% of Caribbean countries are implementing legally binding measures, and none are implementing international voluntary guidelines. Fisheries is one of the world's most dangerous professions, although this is poorly documented in the Caribbean. In relative terms, furthermore, we can say that it is becoming more dangerous as fisherfolk have to go out further and for longer periods to get fish. So there's plenty to do if we want to create a strong base for agriculture and fisheries to contribute better to the livelihoods and to making ours resilient economies. For a start, we need to take market-driven business approaches to agriculture. Agriculture is still not treated as a business. We can't just keep growing and hope to sell, and there's still a lot of that happening. FAO is working with countries across relevant government agencies and private sector to enable and encourage the systematic use of value chain analysis to inform decisions about what value chains should be developed, where should that focus be placed. With a good value chain analysis, there can be good business plans, which is the foundation for facilitating investment. People invest when they know what they're investing in and what the returns are likely to be, and what are the risks that need to be managed. Innovative financial mechanisms that enable inclusive value chain development. And if I had a slide, that inclusive would be in red and double underlined. What Caribbean do we want to build for the future? We want one that offers opportunities broadly across the population for growth and development in agribusiness. There's a lot of interest in these innovative financial mechanisms. We need to keep speaking with the financial institutions, with the development banks, keep engaging in constructive public-private dialogue, and keep learning from experience until we succeed really at democratizing investment opportunity. Not just the financial mechanisms need our attention, but the well-spoken enabling environment. Strengthening of farmers and producer groups, making sure that there are clear rules and transparent processes, streamlined processes for increasing the ease of doing business. Promoting innovation is another area where we need focus. Across the region, there's interest among government agencies and other stakeholders in leveraging knowledge and updated technologies in order to enhance productivity and sustainability of our agriculture. Things like protected structures for agriculture, including hydroponics, integrated aquaculture and aquaponics systems, novel animal feeds and other farming inputs made from regionally available materials, new water cleanup technologies allowing more productive water use and reuse in food and agriculture, solar-powered solutions at many stages of the food chain, digital solutions for early warning, for pest control, for precision input production, for marketing and for traceability, for safety at sea. Innovations in fish boat design to be more energy efficient. Innovations in insurance products, insurance for small farmers, for fishers, for fishing boats, products that make sense in our context. We need innovations in product development, creating new markets. The first speaker spoke about the success in Barbados of roots and tubers. I'm happy to say that FAO was very much involved in that. and we hope to be engaged in a lot more innovation. Many of these innovations exist. Some are even being applied already within the Caribbean, but need to be nurtured. Other innovations need to be adapted to suit our situation, and others need to be reimagined. Innovation is a process. We need that culture of creating our own solutions. We have strong educational institutions, we have the research institutions, and we certainly have the need. Within FAO's program of work in the Caribbean, we are seeking to support this process of renewal and innovation. We can't just flip a switch to transform agriculture and food systems. We need a good plan, steady investment, coordinated effort. Among other things, we need a governmental apparatus that enables and fosters agriculture and agripreneurship. Time is too short now for me to delve into this, but before I end, I would like to underline the critically important regional dimension. It's not just about what individual countries can do, but what we can do together here in the Caribbean. We have rediscovered with this COVID crisis the importance of a regional approach to food security. I've also listened keenly to discussions involving both public and private sectors on the advantage of building competitiveness as a region. Very interesting initiatives are being discussed focusing on cross-country production systems. Perhaps we can analyze various models to support reflections on how this can work for everyone. And of course, the old problem of the logistics of moving food around the Caribbean is still an issue that's awaiting satisfactory solution. There are big challenges, but I do not doubt for a moment our ability to construct good, fit-for-purpose solutions. We need to proceed with urgency. Previous speakers have pointed to the issue of competition for land and water use. Strong and holistic analysis and planning and out-of-the-box thinking are all going to be required to think our way to the future that we want for food and agriculture in the Caribbean. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Renata. And I think you summed it up quite well. There's not necessarily a magic bullet or an easy solution to resolve some of these underlying issues of food security and agricultural productivity in the Caribbean, but certainly innovative approaches are very much required. That brings us to the end of our initial presentations. We have a few questions that have been posted on UETV, and we're trying to group some of those. But maybe if I can start with a first question for Juan Carlos. And that question is, grants and loans from IFIs and large commercial banks have always been available, but those channels are often viewed as too complicated and impractical for small farmers. What can be done to catalyze more private capital investment into agriculture, particularly for small farms and co-ops? Juan Carlos, would you like to take a first go at that, and then we can open up to others as well?
Yeah, I think what we are doing with EcoMicro is exactly a way to prove that it can be done. And in the case of Caribbean, I think part of the solution is finding the right partners. So we have been trying to work with trade unions, so the small institutions that may be able to rapidly get in touch with the farmers, build trust, and being able to receive training to make a compelling case that is not only providing financing, but they can be also a source of training or making the connection with the providers of technology. Because we know, and after hearing all the distinguished panelists, it's not only a matter of having the will. Now we need to innovate and use technology, and some of the technologies are out there. So we need to really tap into the right sources of financing, and climate finance is there, it's available. So finding in a micro level the right financial intermediaries that can, in some cases, play a dual role, not only building trust and providing financing, but making the connection between the farmer and the provider of technology is one of the ways. I'm not saying this is the silver bullet that will solve all the problems, but in this case, we are trying to prove that it works. And so we'll have results, and we'll make sure that we do all the necessary spreading the word and showing the results. So hopefully will be scalable and apply to in a larger scale.
Thanks, Juan Carlos, and apologies for throwing a tough question at you on the get-go. But perhaps, Renata, the CARICOM COVID-19 Food Security Action Plan touches heavily on the role of private sector. From your perspective, would you like to add to that on what can be done to catalyze more private capital investment into agriculture, particularly for smallholder farmers and cooperatives?
Yes, thank you, Regis. Actually, everyone loses if good ideas from smallholder farmers and producers cannot be transformed into something real. So I agree with what Juan Carlos said. I mean, the issue is finding that formula where different types of agencies and institutions are working together to take things forward. In this case, there are some arrangements where, for instance, agencies like FAO provide technical support. We're part of that package of support. So there are the institutions offering finance, but can be coupled with technical support to be building the capacities of the entrepreneurs, to be helping them with what they need to do, at the same time de-risking the process for the lenders. So, I don't think we have all of the answers. I think that some of our financial institutions and development banks also perhaps need to be more open to doing things innovatively. But I think this sort of discussion is a big part of the solution for enhancing investment in economic resilience.
And then I don't know if either Anton from the central bank perspective or Stefan from the DFID perspective, if you'd like to add into that question.
Well, I guess I can comment on that in terms of the Barbados experience. We've always had a great deal of difficulty in terms of adequately funded our agricultural sector. Traditionally, you had the sugar estates and they were funded by the commercial banks. But they ran into problems with the virtual collapse of sugar, and farming itself. You don't see much flow of credit to farming. Currently, there's no local development bank. There is an agency that does some development work, our local enterprise growth fund. So perhaps we need to revisit the whole notion of maybe an agricultural bank, because the farmer does face very specific challenges, which make it difficult for especially small farmers, which make it difficult for commercial banks to venture into that area and be successful. It's a difficult area, and I think maybe the area of peer-to-peer lending can play a part. But I do think you have to look at outside the commercial banking area to fund farming ventures or agricultural ventures because of the risks involved, really.
Great, thank you very much. Perhaps to move to another question, and this one is, one of the considerations we need to address is the ability to store and preserve foods. There's plenty of waste regarding the production of fresh food that is not consumed. How do we address this matter, particularly from a regional perspective, to smooth consumption? And I think we've seen in the very early days of COVID some very concrete implications of this as the tourism industry effectively closed, as Mr. Belgrave highlighted in his presentation. the traditional markets that many farmers and fisher folk used to sell their produce or their fish to had effectively closed, be it restaurants or hotels or the cruise industry. But that said, there are still concerns as we move forward from a longer term perspective. Renata, given the role that FAO plays in this regard, would you like to take a shot at providing some further answer to that one?
Thanks, Regis. I will give it a shot. Before I answer the question directly, I want to go back one step. I mentioned the really poor statistics in the Caribbean on agriculture, poor information that governments keep on who the farmers are, what they're growing, how much they have, what advice to give the growers, what kind of planning can there be in terms of what we're producing. So you don't end up with too much of one thing on the market at one time. And then, hey, what do we do with all of this? So I think it's part of a bigger question about planning and planning for a market. Having said that, the issue about having the Caribbean ready and more prepared to process and to generate value added and to find markets, I think this is a very valid part of the strategy. Okay, but it doesn't happen. It happens. In my presentation, I tried to speak about the importance of value chain analysis. Where are the opportunities? Is it with special honeys? Is it with black belly sheep? Is it, what is it? Is it with the pepper sauce? What can we process that people want to buy? So I think it's there needs to be a new culture of planning and targeting markets. But yes, we need to go there.
Okay, thank you, Renata. Would anyone else like to add to that? No? Okay, a follow-up question. As small producers, meeting quality, production, and packaging standards to export or even supply some local businesses can be extremely prohibitive. What can governments and the development community do to assist small farmers to be able to develop these systems and make them more able to compete regionally and internationally? And that one was also posted on the UE TV website. Renata, would you like to again? Sorry, I realize that's very much in line of some of the work that FAO is doing. So I'm not trying to pick on our sister agency, but perhaps you'd like to take an initial response
one of
to
those
that?
things. Thank you, Regis. When I was speaking, I was saying that there's no flipping of a switch for food system transformation. There are many things that governments need to do. There's an apparatus that needs to be ready. And that notion of food safety and quality control, what are the standards that are needed? Are they realistic standards? In other words, meeting international requirements, but also enforceable in a national context. Do we have systems that set these standards and work with businesses to support compliance? One of the things that struck me with the COVID crisis is a lot of businesses were saying that their third-party audits, which was the system by which they can verify that standards are being met, suddenly many of them couldn't take place. And it is also, these third-party audits, something that often adds a lot of cost to small businesses. Okay, we're doing what we should do, but we also have to pay for the verification. This is actually one of my pet peeves. I believe strongly in the educational system and processes in the Caribbean, and areas where we know we need specialty expertise are things that I think coming out of the University of the West Indies, for instance, much more fit for the work world programs on food safety and quality management that can be spread out, that can be disseminated as short courses for producers. I think that's well within our reach and imagination to be helping people understand what they can do. And of course, it does require some amount of investment to put some of the structural improvements in place. But I do think that we have the means and the knowledge and the systems that could make this knowledge much more readily accessible by our small-scale producers.
Thank you, Renata. And as you were speaking, I was reflecting on this one as well. And I think a few of the comments that we've heard from Juan Carlos on digitalization and technology, some of the comments made before on data that you had made, and clearly management information systems in the agricultural sector are an area where perhaps some greater investment is required. Climate services, understanding markets, et cetera, and clearly there are existing digital solutions that can help with that, and perhaps other solutions out there with some of the innovative thinking that's required. I have, unless anyone else would like to add their voices to that question, I have one final question that we'll take, and then perhaps I think we'll be at the end of our time. But one of the concerns the Caribbean has is with the WTO and its liberalization rules. What flexibility is there for the Caribbean to develop its agricultural sector through protections from cheap goods and dumping from the international markets? I see our audience has geared many tough questions towards the group here. I'm not sure if we have any brave souls that would like to take that one on. Either Juan Carlos from your sort of economic perspective, or Anton from your country perspective, if you'd like to reflect on that.
Well, what I will say to that is that I think while you must respect the WTO's mission, the national imperative is always one of survival. And I don't think that there's any country in the world which fully liberalizes its farming sector, fully gives up its at least part of the ability to feed itself. And I don't see why the Caribbean should be any exception to this trend, given the fact that you can't really guarantee that there will always be an open market in terms of food flowing into your particular territory. So all countries will always preserve some degree of capacity to feed themselves, and I think there is a recognition of that internationally, in spite of the general trend of liberalization. So I think that's all I would say on that for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Would any of the other panelists like to add to that? Juan Carlos?
Well, I wouldn't reflect specifically on the WTO, but I will remember some words from some authorities in the region when they were addressing the food bill. And for example, in the case of Barbados, 90% has to be imported, and in some of the other countries is more than 80%. But if you try to break down where this food is coming, we argue that some of the food, or most of the food, is coming not from the members of CARICOM or Caribbean countries. So some of the authorities, including Prime Minister Motley, was saying, okay, we should make an effort for a coordinated effort to plan and strategize so we can really decrease the amount of food we are bringing from outside CARICOM, and maybe use our own production to really create the basis for food security and economic diversification without relying on imports from Europe or from some other countries, which doesn't sound like protectionism. It's more like trying to use integration as a right tool to growth and also food security, and taking advantage of the diversity of the countries. I don't know if that's the spirit of the question, but when I heard you talking about it, I remember that, and I was going to talk about it when I made my presentation, but I forgot. When the idea of what are the policy decisions, what are the missing parts in this puzzle, I was going to say better or more efficient integration because it addresses both sides of the discussion. It's economic diversification and food security, taking advantage of the strengths, I wouldn't say weaknesses, but of all the countries.
Excellent point, and I think that's, that integration obviously at the CARICOM level is something that is perhaps a bit more feasible than other regions around the world. The CARICOM has been bringing these discussions together to the table with ministries of agriculture and looking at, again, addressing some of the issues that Renata mentioned around logistics and moving food production around the region, of better understanding supply and demand in each country, looking at how inter-regional trade can be enhanced, and obviously that's part of that package. But then, of course, the integration with markets around the world. It is a global environment, and small island developing states through CARICOM or in the Caribbean are able to bring a bit more of economy of scale into those discussions. Did anyone else want to add to that last question? Renata, go ahead.
Yeah, just very, very quickly in relation to the issue of WTO liberalization and the dumping of foods. I just want to add that the WTO rules actually leaves it in countries' power, not only in countries' power, but their responsibility to safeguard the country from substandard products. So assuming that same governmental apparatus that I spoke about for standards of food quality and safety exists, and that they have programs of surveillance and monitoring that function, there is absolutely no one or that would require them to accept substandard food. So the dumping of food is not an issue in relation to going against WTO rules. An issue that has been brought up is to what extent is some protectionism legitimate? And, I'm very interested to listen to the discussions around this COVID period, where countries are beginning to recognize a national security need to be safeguarding supply chains. So perhaps there will be some interesting discussion in fora, such as the WTO, on what this means.
Yeah, excellent. And Stefan, over to you, please.
Just wanted to chime in on a small comment on that question, but mainly just a couple of wrap-up points from me. Just on that question, obviously, the UK has recognised the vulnerability that Caribbean producers face in the international marketplace, and that's one of the reasons why we continue to guarantee preferential access to UK markets post Brexit to producers of banana, rum, sugar, and other products. I kind of defer to the agricultural experts around the table on many of the questions that have been asked. But in terms of what we've heard from the presentations and also some of the questions, I just wanted to underline a couple of points. I think there's a real urgency around this situation. As Renata said, business as usual won't do. And business as usual takes us to a place where, if you recall Justin Ram's diagram on economic growth in the region, takes us to a place where this region is lagging behind all others by 2050. So in the agricultural sector, clearly there's an important conversation that has formed the bulk of this panel discussion about how to drive productivity improvements and where the new niches are for the Caribbean in the global marketplace and how it can catalyse engagement there. But there is this wider discussion that remains really important about how do you move beyond the region's narrow economic base to new sectors like the digital economy, like business outsourcing, like renewable energy, like the creative arts sector. How do you build comparative advantage for this region? in those areas to help it withstand some of the shocks that will be coming down the line in the future. And there's been a lot of important issues raised around access to finance, particularly private sector, around innovation, how you invest in capability in these areas for the long term. And that's the conversation we need having, both in this room and moving out of this room going forward, about how the region is going to economically transform itself to take advantages of the new global economy going forward. So I just wanted to sort of try and pull together a few threads of the conversation there just at the end. Thanks.
Perfect, and thanks for that. And I think we are just about to be cut off, so I'll leave those final closing points from Stefan. I think were a very good summary. Just to extend a sincere thanks to the four panelists for your very insightful inputs. I'd also like to thank UNDP, under the overall leadership of the UN Resident Coordinator, for organizing this series of conferences and ensuring that food security was part of the agenda. Also to UETV for hosting this event, and finally to you, the participants, for listening in, for engaging with this topic, and for your excellent questions. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.